I never thought I would have to say these words out loud even now as I see. They're the same feeling washes over me. Like a cold wave I can't escape. How could I let something like this happen? How could I have let it get this far? The truth is, I'm embarrassed to even speak of it, but it feels like the only way to finally let go of what's been haunting me before we dive in. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for more captivating true confessions like this one. Don't forget to watch till the end and hit the like button to show your support. It's strange. You know how the mind can convince you that you're doing the right thing, even when you know deep down that it's wrong. It was never supposed to be like this. What started as a moment of weakness spiraled into something I couldn't control, and now I'm left with the guilt, the confusion, and the unbearable truth that tried to forget it, tried to bury it under the surface where it couldn't hurt me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the reality of what happened. Now, sitting here, I realize just how much damage has been done. How could I explain this to anyone? How do you tell someone that you crossed a line so unforgivable, a line that should never have been there in the first place? I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself, but maybe telling you this, maybe confessing will be the first step in facing what I've done. Looking back, I can almost convince myself that everything seemed perfectly normal. At first, it was one of those evenings where the world felt calm, the kind of night where the ordinary things in life taken an almost comforting routine. My mom had just finished cooking dinner, and the three of us, my mom, Greg, and I, sat down at the table. There was laughter, light conversation, and the clinking of silverware against porcelain for Amentit. Felt like we were a family, just like any other. But if I'm being honest with myself, I know that wasn't the truth. I could feel it. Even then, the shift in the air between Greg and me. It was subtle, at first easy to dismiss as nothing more than a passing thought or a flick of attention, but it was there, undeniable in its quiet insistence. I'd catch myself glancing at him, watching how he laughed at my mom's jokes, how his eyes sparkled in the soft light of the dining room. I tried not to look too long, tried to brush off the strange sensation crawling up my spine, but it wasn't easy. I wasn't sure what to make of it, this Eunice that had begun to settle inside. I didn't want to admit that something inside me was changing, that the easy comfort of our family dinners was starting to feel different. What was it? A shift I couldn't explain. Was it just me? Or was something shifting in the space between us? Something that, for reasons I couldn't yet understand, I wasn't ready to face it. The moment my mom walked out the door, I felt it. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I knew something was different. She'd left for another one of her business trips, the kind she'd taken so many times before. But this time it felt as though she wasn't just leaving the house, she was leaving behind the fragile balance of our family. It stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her pull out of the driveway. There was a quiet emptiness in the house now, an absence that I hadn't fully realized until it settled over me. And then it was just Greg and me. The space between us felt strange at first. It was nothing, just the usual small talk, the kind that comes when two people are alone, but unsure of what to say. I had expected to feel relief, to enjoy the quiet, but instead it was as if the air had thickened, and suddenly every word felt led with something unsaid. We talked about little things, dinner plans, show our days had been, but there was a subtle shift in how we spoke to each other. The distance that had always existed between us was beginning to shrink. I noticed how his hand brushed against mine when we reached for the same mug, how his gaze lingered a moment too. Long when we made eye contact, it felt intimate, but in a way that made my heart race. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down I knew something was changing, something that hadn't been there before, and now with my mom gone, it was just the two oasis. It's hard to describe exactly when it all began. At first, everything seemed so innocent, just simple moments that I could brush aside. But now looking back, I realized those moments weren't as insignificant as I thought. I couldn't escape the way they lingered in my mind, replaying over and over again, as though I couldn't quite make sense of them. It started one afternoon when Greg walked into the kitchen as casually as always did. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, but then he did something that stopped me in my tracks. She didn't have a shirt on, I swear. Time slowed down as my eyes involuntarily traced the muscles in his back, the way the light caught his skin. I wasn't prepared for it, and it rattled me more than I wanted to admit. The moment stretched, filled with a strange silence that I couldn't escape. He didn't seem to notice my hesitation, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. I should have looked away. I should have said something, but I didn't. I just stood there, frozen, feeling the heat rise in my chest as my breath caught for a second, longer than it should have. It was as if I had crossed a line without even knowing it. He told myself it was nothing after all. It was just Greg, my mom's boyfriend, a guy I'd known for years, but that's the thing, isn't it? It wasn't nothing. Later that evening, as I stirred dinner, the silence in the room felt heavier than it had. Before, the house seemed smaller, as though the walls were closing in. I wore a light sheer outfit, something I wouldn't have thought twice about before. But tonight it felt different. When Greg entered the kitchen, his gaze met mine. The briefness of the look was enough to stop. My heart, there was a shift in there. A tension that neither of us acknowledged it, but both of us felt it. Thick, suffocating, and impossibly uncomfortable it was. As if every emotion, every unspoken thought we'd buried deep within us had somehow slipped into the open hanging between us, like a weight that neither of us knew how to lift. Even though we never dared to speak a word of it, the silence that enveloped us felt heavier than any conversation we might have had. The words we couldn't find the courage to say, holding a quiet power over both of us. It lingered in the room, palpable and pressing, as if the air itself had become thick with something unspoken. I wanted to shatter that silence, to say anything, to bring relief to attention. But I was frozen, terrified of the unknown consequences that might follow. If I did, what was happening to us? Why couldn't I just let go of this strange, overwhelming feeling? This wasn't how it was supposed to be. There was no reason for me to feel this way. No explanation for why this moment had become so charged. It was supposed to be a normal day, just like any other, no more significant than walking through the parking lot. With my mind lost in the usual trivialities, and yet in the blink of an eye everything had changed. I was simply walking, my thoughts distant and mundane. When I collided with Greg, it wasn't anything more than a brief unintentional bump. But it was enough to make me stumble back, my balance thrown off for a few awkward steps. The moment hung there, suspended in its discomfort, and I didn't know how to brush it off, how to move past the sudden clumsiness. And then in that instant I dropped my keys. They slipped from my hand and skittered across the pavement, coming to rest. Just a few feet away, I muttered a quiet curse under my breath, my fingers already reaching for them, but then, as if in slow motion, it happened. Just as I bent down to retrieve the keys, I realized Greg was doing the same thing. Our hands brushed, and in that brief fleeting moment, everything changed. It was a simple touch, so brief that I could almost convince myself it was nothing, but I felt it, a spark that shot through my fingers, a warmth that spread out my arm as though something electric had passed between us. My breath caught in my throat as I involuntarily looked up, meeting his eyes in a glance that lasted far longer than it should have. Time seemed to pause, the world falling silent, as if everything had stopped in that single shared moment. There was a tension in the air, something palpable and undeniable, yet neither of us could name. It wasn't just a casual brush of hands. It was something deeper, something unspoken that neither of us had the courage to address, let alone acknowledge. His gaze lingered on mine longer than it should have, and in that fleeting connection, I saw something there, a flicker of emotion, something I couldn't quite place, but that sent a shiver down my spine. It was an unspoken understanding, a silent recognition of Something shared, something neither of us had anticipated, but both of us felt. Webeth quickly pulled our hands away as if the touch had been too much. But the silence that followed felt charged, like the air had thickened, saturated with something I couldn't explain. I forced Asmile, hoping to convince myself and him that it didn't matter, that it was nothing but inside. My heart was racing, my mind reeling with the question, why did that brief touch feel like it had changed everything? Why did it feel like the air had become electric in a way I couldn't ignore? And more than anything, I couldn't help but wonder if Greg had felt it too. I was the only one caught in the strange, overwhelming pull of that unspoken connection. It was one of those bitterly cold nights when the air seemed to cling to your skin, biting at the edges of your thoughts, as if the very atmosphere wanted to invade your mind and settle there. The power cut out without warning, and within moments the house was swallowed by an eerie, suffocating silence. I initially thought the blackout would be nothing more than a small inconvenience, a fleeting moment of disruption. But the stillness that followed felt different in ways I couldn't fully grasp. It was heavy, thick, and inescapable against me, as if the night itself had become a living entity. Greg and I found ourselves in the living room, both of us caught off guard by the sudden quiet that enveloped us. The house, now plunged into darkness, felt both vast and intimate in a strange way. The absence of all the usual noise, the hum of appliances, the distant whir of their refrigerator made everything else seem amplified. Every small sound became significant, the soft rustle of fabric as we shifted the sound of our breaths in the still air. It was as if the silence had peeled away all the layers between us, leaving just the two of us exposed and close in the dark. Our hands reached for the same blanket at the same time, our fingers brushing as we both attempted to tug it from the couch. A soft, nervous laugh escaped my lips, and I found myself momentarily embarrassed by how awkward it felt. "Guess we're sharing this, Greg." Seidi's voice, low and unexpectedly warm, grounding me in them. I nodded but couldn't find my voice to speak. There was no reason to be anxious. It was just a blanket, just the two of us huddling together against the cold. But when he sat down next to me, pulling the blanket over us, the space between us seemed to shrink in a way that left me unsettled. It wasn't just physical closeness, it was something else. Something more intimate, that made the air around us feel thicker. We sat there closer than I'd ever allowed myself to be with anyone before, and yet it wasn't out of necessity. It was as if we had no choice but to sit like this side by side together in the dim glow of a flickering candle. The soft flickering light illuminated his face, casting shadows that seemed to reveal more of him than I was used to seeing. It made him feel closer, as if the distance between us had been erased, as if nothing could hide what was right in front of me. Anymore, I looked at him, then really looked at him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't look away. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, I knew we weren't just sharing a blanket. We were sharing something deeper, something unsaid, a connection that neither of us could deny. The silence stretched between us, long and pregnant with unspoken words, a quiet that spoke volumes. "What do you think about when you're alone like this?" Greg's voice, soft and casual, broke the silence. But there was something else there, a depth that caught me off guard. I could sense that there was more to his question than held it on, and for a moment I hesitated, unsure whether I wanted to let him in. But the vulnerability in the air, the way we sat so close in the dark, seemed to make it impossible to hold back. I let the words slip out before I could stop them. "I think about things I never tell anyone," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Things that are too complicated, too tangled. I think about the future, what it might hold, what could be." The words tumbled out before I could stop them, and once they did, there was no taking them back. Greg was quiet for a moment, processing my words, and then he shifted, slightly his shoulder brushing mine, Ashy leaned a little closer. What if the future is different then? We expect he asked, his voice, barely audible, almost lost in the quiet of the room. So, his question lingered in the air, making the space between us feel even smaller, as if the room itself was folding in around us. I looked at him again, and this time it was as if the distance between us wasn't just physical. It was as if we were beginning to understand each other on a deeper level, without needing to speak another word. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, it was full, rich within spoken meaning. It was as though we were sharing something and spoken a truth that neither of us was willing to name. I realized in that moment how much I had allowed myself to feel, and for the first time I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop. The air between seemed to hold everything I hadn't said, everything I'd kept hidden, and yet it didn't feel like too much. It felt like something we could handle, something I could trust. Later, when the night had deepened and the house had settled into an almost a natural stillness, the kind that only comes when the rest of the world is asleep and you're left alone, with nothing but your thoughts, I found myself in the kitchen. I had been there for what felt like hours, mindlessly cleaning surfaces, rearranging things. But my hands moved without thought. My mind, however, was elsewhere. It was always like that. When Greg was near, his presence seemed to pull me out of reality, making everything feel sharper, more vivid, and yet it wasn't the usual chaos of thoughts. It was something different, something more like a quiet, waiting, uncertain. I stood frozen in place. Hadn't heard him approach yet. There he was, suddenly at my side, standing so close that I could feel the heat of his presence. At first, we didn't speak. The silence that enveloped us was thick, almost tangible, as though it held the weight of its own pressing down on me with an almost suffocating intensity. I could feel every small movement of my body, each breath that escaped my lips, magnified in the stillness. I couldn't tell if he was waiting for me to speak, or if he too was uncertain of how to break the silence. The air between us seemed charged with anticipation, thickening as seconds stretched into what felt like eternity. With each passing moment, the distance between us seemed to shrink, drawing us closer, yet neither of us moved. The proximity was undeniable, impossible to ignore. I could feel the subtle alignment of our bodies, the space between us so minuscule. It might as well have been inexistent. I could sense his presence more keenly than I could see it, and in some way that only made it worse. It was like an electric current running between a pressure building in my chest that mirrored the rapid thewing of my heart. My pulse raced, and the sound of it seemed to echo in my ears, growing louder. With each passing second, I wanted to retreat, to step back, to escape the heat of his proximity, to break the tension. But something inside me held me rooted to the spot. I didn't move. And then, without any warning, he leaned in for armament. I thought I had imagined it, that the tension had played tricks on me. But then, his lips were on mine, soft, warm, and undeniably real. Everything around us faded away. The world, the silence, the uncertainty had all vanished, leaving nothing but the sensation of the kiss. It was as if a moment had been building 4 days, weeks, months, and unstoppable force that finally erupted. Into that one instant there was no hesitation, no skin thoughts. It was pure, unrestrained, and it was everything. It was a release from the tension, the confusion, and all the feelings that had been silently simmering beneath the surface for so long. Finally, it had nowhere to go but into this one charged moment. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, pulled back, neither of us spoke. The silence, suffocating. I couldn't look at him, couldn't even think straight. My heart was racing, my breath shallow. What had we just done? What had I just allowed? Like that it was the end. I stood facing the kitchen sink, and in what felt like a flash, I heard his footsteps. In a split second, he cued my chest firmly into his big arms. It felt great. I felt his stick poking me from the back. It was at this moment I turned to face him. I gave him the hard and most passionate kiss, Her we kept kissing for what felt like. Forever I was feeling very hot. He guided me to the bed and in a flash, took off his clothes revealing his hairy chest and firm abs. I did the same, revealing my body. That was when I saw what my mom had been enjoying all along. His stick was the biggest I'd ever seen in my life. It spread my legs, and he guided himself in. He held him by the face as he went. Straight in, it felt so good. Could this be pleasure? He didn't move. And I could feel a whole lot of sensation around. My lower leg, my toes were numb and fragile. I let out a loud scream. I couldn't suppress it. But he paid no attention, but rather went deeper. Gosh, I loved it when it was all over. I couldn't bring myself to move. My legs felt like they had been drained of all strength. And I couldn't remember when I had fallen asleep. I sat at my desk the next morning, the journaling open in front of me, but the words I desperately sought to write wouldn't come. My hands hovered over the page, trembling ever so slightly while my mind replayed the events of the previous night. I couldn't escape the weight of it, that unbearable heaviness. The kiss, how it had felt, both completely natural and yet profoundly wrong in those fleeting moments of confusion. I almost managed to convince myself that it hadn't happened, that I hadn't allowed it to happen. But deep inside I knew the truth, and it gnawed at me relentlessly, like a wound that wouldn't heal. The guilt was suffocating. I couldn't look at the journal in front of me because I knew that no matter what I wrote, it would be tainted by the shame that clouded every thought in my mind. How could I have let myself fall into this? It wasn't just the kiss. It was everything that had led up to it. The lingering glances, the subtle but undeniable connection, the moments of unspoken understanding that had seemed innocent at the time but now felt like a slow, inevitable unraveling. I hadn't intended for it to happen, but now it had, and I couldn't take it back just then. Greg walked into the room. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate, almost like he was trying to ground himself. I looked up at him, my heart hammering in my chest, but I couldn't seem to find the words to speak. He stood there for a long moment as if gathering the courage to continue before speaking softly, his voice almost fragile. "We need to talk." The words hung in there, thick with tension, each one heavier than the last. He sat down beside me, and for what felt like an eternity, neither of us said a word. We both seemed to be grappling with the enormity of what had happened, unsure how to face the aftermath. Finally, Greg broke silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what happened last night," he said, "but I know it can't happen again." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settled deep in my chest. "I feel the same way," I whispered, back my voice betraying the emotion. I couldn't contain it. Shouldn't have happened. It was a mistake. We sat in silence again, the words suspended between us like a fragile thread threatening to snap. A tiny moment neither of us wanted to acknowledge how much everything had changed, but we couldn't pretend it hadn't. "I don't want this to tear us apart," Greg said after a long pause, his voice firm but tinged with emotion. "We've to move on for the sake of our family." I nodded again, though I wasn't sure if I was nodding to him or to myself. "As you're right," I replied, the words heavy and burdened as they left my lips. "We can't let this ruin what we've built. I don't want to lose everything." It wasn't an easy resolution, and I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be simple. But in that moment, I understood that we had no choice but to bury it deep within ourselves, to move forward, as though nothing had changed, for the family, for the life we had worked so hard to build. And yet, even as I agreed to try to move on, a part of me couldn't forget. A part of me knew that something had shifted. And no matter how hard we tried to bury it, I wondered how long we could keep it hidden. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Before we say goodbye, if you have not yet subscribed, I invite you to press the subscribe button. Your support, even if it seems like a small gesture, means a lot and drives us to continue creating content with heart. don't forget to give it a like if you liked what we shared today, as every interaction helps us grow and allows us to continue connecting with you through stories that matter. Thank you for being part of this community.